Excellent. All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Kara Larson, and I'm a PhD student here at UMA. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Richardson. Sarah is a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Her dissertation research is titled Determining the Nature of Early Bronze Age Free Households and Spatial Use in the Southern Levant, a digital analysis from es-Safi Gath. She has years of experience, of excavation experience and survey experience across the Levant, including work at es-Safi, Tel Zakat, and the Timna Valley Research Project, all of which she has produced publications on. Today, she will be presenting a talk entitled Digitizing Non-Digital Data, Time, Issues, and Monotony in the Process of Digitizing Ph.D. Data. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you, Kara, for that wonderful introduction. It's great to join you all today, and thank you for having me. As Kara said, I'll be talking about digitizing data, the process that has been this PhD so far, and the hurdles that many face when undertaking a project with legacy data. So, to dive right in. As Kara mentioned, my PhD research is on the site of es-Safi Gath. So I'm going to give you guys a brief overview of the site, and then I'm going to go into the why do we digitize data, the process of digitization, hurdles in digitizing data, and current and future research. Because integrating data sets and incorporating legacy data is a part of the process when working with archaeological materials. It just comes with the field. es-Safi, as the subject of my PhD, has provided ample opportunities for both the digitization of legacy data and the integration of multiple data sets. So it's kind of where I'm coming from with this entire talk. So the site of es-Safi, as shown here, is also referred to as biblical Gath, or the Philistines, and was settled intermittently from the Chalcolithic period, so the 5th millennium BC, through to 1948, when the state of Israel was established. Beginning in 1841, there are numerous archaeologists that map the site, and this continued on to the end of the 19th century. However, there were no archaeological excavations at the site until those of Bliss and McAllister, who excavated so many sites in the region in 1898 and 1899. So there were occasional small excavations following Bliss and McAllister's during the British Mandate and after the founding of Israel. However, these were no more than small salvage excavations and surveys until Bar-Ilan University began their expedition in 1996, led by Aaron Mayer, the fruit of which I will present some of today. And this is the excavation that has continued from 1996 until the present. So, taking a step back briefly, the site of es-Safi Gath is located on the border of the Shephelah, or the Judean Highlands, and the southern coastal plain of modern Israel. So this area is low rolling hills that indicate the ascent into the hill country, and they cover 790 square kilometers. This region is crossed with 5 river valleys, as you can see on the screen, that form natural routes of movement and provide access to the mountains and other regions from the east to the coastal plain in the west. So all of the sites in the Shephelah from the early Bronze Age are located on the borders of 2 of the 5 river valleys that comprise the Shephelah. So these high ridges provide plentiful water, fertile soil, and a climate conducive for agriculture, as well as high outlook points, which ensured safety for the gathered populations. Before any excavations took place at Safi, there was a pre-excavation survey conducted by Bar-Ilan. It collected a large amount of early Bronze Age pottery on and surrounding the Tell. Just as a background, a Tell is a man-made hill over years of occupation. It kind of builds up. So it became clear during the survey and with the distribution of the pottery sherds that the site was one of the largest in the course of the early Bronze Age, at approximately 24 hectares or about 59 acres. The widespread nature of the early Bronze Age excavated deposits, in addition to excavated and surface ceramics, suggests that the entire tell was occupied during the early Bronze. And the settlement was fortified with stone-based walls, which are built actually on earlier occupation phases rather than on bedrock. Even though the entirety of the tell appears to have been occupied, I'm focusing on area E for my research, which is the only place that we have reached a full horizon of early Bronze Age materials. So I want to note to that effect that the process of digitization that I'm talking about today is not on the entire site as of yet. My dissertation has focused, as I said, on area E for the east end of the tell. We archaeologists are really creative sometimes. It has multiple layers of occupation, including late Bronze and Iron Age excavation or occupation stratas that have been excavated. However, like I said, I'll focus on the early Bronze Age. So even though the rest of the excavations on the tell began in 1996, Area E was not opened until 2004. And then it was continuously excavated season after season until 2017. So the early bronze deposits that I'm going to talk about today, or that I'm going to talk about digitizing today, in any case, are attributed to an approximately 300-year time period between 2550 and 2850 BCE. And they represent a non-elite urban domestic neighborhood with at least 6, maybe 7 houses that we can see some information in. And most of these are portions of houses, but there's 2 full ones that we are researching right now. And this is what we're seeing in the archaeological record. The map on your screen shows these houses. So there's one here, here. So there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and in some phases we see a 7th house over here. But just so that as I show the maps, you kind of get a feel for what you're looking at. So that's great about the site. Oh, and before we dive any more into the data that I have been working on, let's take a minute to talk about why do we bother to digitize the data? Most of the data from sites excavated in the 20th century and before are still on paper. So I'll talk about es-Safi specific materials in a bit, but if we stop to think about it, there's a whole can of worms that comes with analog data or paper-based data. When we're dealing with paper records, we're also dealing with the effects that time has on these mediums. Ink and pencil fade, paper rips or becomes stained or waterlogged. There are various efforts being made now that deal solely with creating backups of these records, digitizing them in some way, shape, or form. Because as every introductory to archaeology student is taught, records are vital. Archaeology is not a renewable resource. You can never put everything back where it came from once it's been excavated. In addition to all of the other parts, time on the records, the sooner that these records can be gone through and digitized and fully cataloged, the better. One of the joys of legacy data is hoping that there is still someone around that can decipher the shorthand used in field books, someone who can fill the gaps that supervisors knew in their own heads but didn't think to write down, and someone who can help pull everything together. Even when we aren't dealing with legacy data or extremely old legacy data, this can be a chore sometimes. From the field to camp, even I will go, what did I mean here? So not only is the process of digitization important for preserving data, it's vital in the ongoing process of in the ongoing processing of materials, future studies, and the implementation of new technologies and techniques. And that's kind of where my digitization comes in, is more of the implementation of the new technologies and techniques. es-Safi, for almost all of their excavation seasons, has paper records, meticulous notes, hand-drawn maps, which I'll talk about in a bit. And because it's such a new excavation, we haven't yet reached the point of these papers disintegrate when we touch them. These journals fall apart as we open them, like other sites in the region. So how do we start with digitizing data? The 300-year period at es-Safi that I mentioned earlier was excavated over roughly 14 seasons and required countless hours of digitization of plans and field journals until the final seasons, 2015, 16, and 17. There were challenges in the standardization process of digitally collecting the data. And I'm going to kind of go through these group by group. So I'll start with the most recent excavation seasons and progress backwards through the different levels of initial digitization. I do want to stress that I was lucky in some ways that various others had attempted to digitize the data from 2012 onward. But this was handed off every couple of years. And as you might imagine, with each new attempt or each new person came a different approach. Some tried to build on the old approaches and take some things from previous work while leaving the rest, making where I picked it up from a bit of a hodgepodge of approaches. And as I worked through, I saw that some data had been skipped entirely, while others had been entered again and again and again. So this is one of the joys of working with databases and the joys of working with data that other people have worked with. I don't say joy in a sarcastic way at all. It's actually interesting to see what data has been skipped, why people would have skipped that data, etc. So the entire process really was in 3 stages, which was scanning. So you had hand-drawn top plans and field journals that were scanned in, we created PDFs out of those. So archiving those. And then from there, as I said, there were 3 groups of different stages of in-field digitization. And I worked with each of those individually. And then finally, I gathered, centralized, and integrated all of the specialist databases, which I'll talk about after the in-field digitization information. So as I mentioned, the last 3 seasons of excavation were the most systematized and standardized in data collection and recording. There was a total station in use every day. So this would take points or elevations and boundaries for features, such as walls and hearths and floors, as well as daily basket boundaries or opening and closing of locus boundaries. So for those who don't know, baskets are what we call in the Near East, at least, what we call the materials that we found. They're put into a basket. Each day gets a different basket number for the same material type, etc. So if we didn't take locus boundaries, we could use the daily basket boundaries to recreate the locus boundaries. We collapse them into the definition of an area of a locus with upper and lower elevations. And if we needed to, the daily baskets provided a smaller area to define centroids or centers of the boundaries, which I'll talk about later, and that really plays into my analysis. In addition, daily baskets were really useful when we needed to split the different loci. If something was missed in the field, say we dug right through a floor, it happens. So these last 3 years and the types of data that we had were what I strive to recreate as much as possible when dealing with the earlier seasons of excavation. So it had the most data and the least recreation of the data from the field. 2012 through 2014. During these seasons, there was a total station in use for the collection of data, though the types of data that were collected were not as widespread or systematic as the later seasons. It was kind of the intermediate phase between just recording everything on paper and having a machine to help us. So often we only had one elevation at the end of the day, and special finds points were taken. So when we found something extraordinary in the field, we'd take a point and go, this is where we found it. Occasionally, walls were put in there, elevations, tops, bottoms, lengths. This being said, it was an intermediate period. So there were hand-drawn top plans that were meticulously drawn and then later scanned. And I was able to put them into the software that I used to georeference them to allow the inclusion of boundaries of baskets to be drawn in for the 2013 and 14 seasons. The 2012 season, however, was an anomaly in the excavations at the site. During this season, they tried to implement a totally digital approach, all in one fell swoop, no paper backups. Unfortunately, the database was corrupted late in the season, and they remembered why you don't save over your last save, why you always have staggered saves. So all of the data was lost. Thus, the digitization process took a bit more time here than with the 2015 and later seasons. It also put, as you can imagine, the excavators kind of off of using a fully digital framework in the future. So 2004 through 2011 was probably, aside from 2012, the seasons that took the most time individually. There was no digital base for them. These 8 seasons, I also had to sort through because for my research, as I mentioned, we're focusing on the early bronze data, but these are the first seasons of excavation in that area that they started reaching early bronze levels. Okay, so not all of the squares or excavation areas had reached those levels yet. Some of them would jump from Iron Age to early bronze. And the excavators were still sorting through the intrusions from the later periods. They also didn't have the digital recording devices available that were available in the later seasons, including the total station. So each square did have a daily hand-drawn top plan, completed by an area or square supervisor, depending on the year. So this usually at least provided general boundaries for the loci and baskets that were excavated each day. The elevations were available on lists that were kept by the wonderful person in charge. However, the maps that I mentioned, hand-drawn top plans, were of 2 varieties. We had some that were like this beautiful one here, with clear boundaries of the baskets, meticulously drawn features, and both the locus and basket numbers present. You can also see clear boundaries for the square, such as these. It's absolutely beautiful. And you can see much of, if not all of, the graph paper lines, which is important when you're recreating even the best of maps in a digital database. However, there were also a number of fees. You can see the graph paper. That's really wonderful. You can see sort of the squares delineated, but then you start seeing floating elevations, floating locus numbers, no basket numbers, no indications really at all. So I do want to stress that most of the maps that I had to recreate for a lot of the seasons were more like this than like that. But c'est la vie. Other hurdles in the process besides the maps, because the mapping, while it was time consuming, is only one of the hurdles I had to face while working with these data. Among others was a complete loss of the 2012 database that I mentioned. Like I said, this is the only year that they tried to go completely digital with no paper backups. So it should be noted that as wonderful as digitizing data is, the paper records are vital as well. And it's always a good idea not to write over the most recent save. The other issue that I faced was integrating multiple specialist databases into one master database. Now, don't get me wrong, we do have a site-wide database that records all of the basic information, such as the find type, the date, the square, the locus, the season, etc. But as with many other sites, we also had specialists working with the materials. So someone working on the faunal materials, someone working on the flint, someone working on the pottery. And they each had their own database that provided their specific analytical data. Sizes of each pottery sherd or each flint blade, what type of blade it was, the material that it was, which type of flint it was made out of, these types of things. These had not been integrated or even linked into a master database. And honestly, on that front, I'm still working out some kinks. But to accomplish the research for my dissertation, it's been vital to have one mastermind behind all of the rest of the data. As you can imagine, this has been a bit of a challenge. So in the short term, I've created a link or reference database to connect all of the specialized information with the basket boundaries that are in the mapping software. All of these are technological issues as of yet. The final and probably the overarching hurdle in the process was how monotonous it is. Look at the map, click a point on the screen, draw a line from that point to another point and connect all of the dots, and there's your basket. We all have had to stare at a screen all day. I get it. It gets long, we get bored, and eventually we wander off into Facebook or Netflix land. And if I had to name the biggest hurdle that I faced, this would be it. It never seemed as though it was going to end. That being said, for the most part, it has ended. The digitization of the early Bronze Age materials are, for the most part, done. We're still working out a few things with the excavators, but a final digitized map looks something like the one shown here. After all the boundaries are put in and all the centers of those baskets are calculated, this is where I start with my analysis. Months and months of transcribing hand-drawn maps has led to these wonderful points on your screen. Each of these points does not represent one basket, but it represents many. So each of the materials from a singular day is represented by a different basket, and each of these points represents a different day of excavation, if that makes sense. So for instance, one of these points might represent a basket of pottery, a basket of bone, a basket of flint, and a basket of groundstone tools, which are all separated. So like I said, in essence, each of these points represents at least 4 different material types and hundreds of individual artifacts. So all of the digitization, all of the maps that are created, they all have a point. They all go to spatial analysis. So the early bronze strata from Area E at es-Safi comprise the dissertation data, which investigates house space and use during this period. Each of the issues that I ran into during the process of digitizing data has put constraints on the analytical methods that are able to be employed. So if I can get a little technical for a few minutes, most of the materials that are being used for spatial analysis have basket boundaries that they are associated with. However, any clustering of materials such as flint or bone within these daily baskets were often not recorded on a map, even if they're mentioned in the daily written field notes. Yay. So therefore, there are 2 routes to take when I'm looking at data and analysis. So I can either, 1, assume that there's an even distribution of materials across the daily basket, or 2, assign the center point of the basket as the location of all of these materials. As the special finds were also point data, and some classes of materials such as groundstones, because they're so large, were taken as points. Using the second method has been the choice so far, in conjunction with, here's the technical part, a modified hotspot analysis. So you take and you look and see which types of points are clustered where. So this has allowed each of the material data sets to be analyzed independently, as well as in larger groups. So I can look at flint blades and the different types of flint blades and how they're distributed, but I can also look at flint blades, groundstone tools, and bone tools all together. So we can analyze them in a large group, such as tools. This leads into the current and future research that I've been working on. One of the biggest projects so far has been the spatial analysis of the bone tools that were recovered. And I'm going to drone on and on about it for a minute here. One of the reasons that this is such a big thing is that we're using basket boundaries and center points that are linked to, say, the faunal assemblage. So we can integrate materials back into the larger finds assemblage that are identified as tools, ornaments, or toys. That's great. Why wouldn't we be able to do that otherwise? Well, without the basket boundaries being in, it's difficult to go back and say, well, this is the general area that these things were found in. This is often an issue when dealing with large tell sites, such as Safi, because the identification of, let's say, bone tools in the field is difficult. They can get lost within a larger faunal assemblage unless students and volunteers and other excavators know exactly what they're looking for. It's hard to identify them. And even for the trained eye, when they're dirty, fragmentary, and let's be honest, for a lot of people, not nearly as exciting as, say, beads or flint or more obvious materials, they often get tossed into a bag that the faunal analyst looks at later. So being able to more fully represent these tool types in the site records is extremely important. And that's something that I was able to do so far in the PhD, at least. And so on your screen, you see a couple photos, or you see a photo of bone tools. So it's a handle fragment, a scraper, an awl, point. So these were all found in the faunal analysis rather than recorded as special finds. So being able to integrate these back into the research is important. Yes, responding to the Q&A, it is essential to be able to consider a bone tool assemblage after the zooarch analysis has been completed. So not only am I looking at the bone tools as much as I've rambled about them, but I'm also looking at the other materials, flint, groundstones. I'm taking a look at cooked versus not cooked bone, boiled versus burned, the distribution of different pottery types as well, so that hopefully we can look and see about a change in space and the change in the use in the space through different architectural phases. So something I didn't mention before is the early bronze. When we look at it, it isn't all in one phase. It's not just one occupation. We have 6 occupation phases, and in there we have, if we include the subphases, there's a total of 9. So we can see how things have changed through each architectural shift, whether it's a renovation or a complete rebuilding. And my interest personally is seeing whether or not they kept everything in the same places. And you can somewhat see that through hearths and through your stone floors, but the material assemblage is a lot more important to, or can be implemented more to look at that, excuse me. So that leads into the reconstruction of the use of space and also household level production in the period. So bone tools were used for weaving, for leather working, for a number of other things. So we know for a fact that at Safi, during the early bronze, pottery wasn't made at the household level. But what I'm hoping to see is whether through the tool assemblages, if we can see any sort of household level of production. Is there weaving? Is there leatherworking? Is there painting, etc.? So, no, I'm a little short on time, i.e. I went a little short with my presentation, but I want to thank you all and open it up for Q&A. I apologize, I talked a little fast.
No, you're good. Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that wonderful presentation. If anyone has any questions, if you could please pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we'll give people a top minute just to type in any questions that they may have. I know I have maybe not so much a question, but maybe more so advice. Especially when you're working with projects that have overlapped, like, you know, they may have excavated in like the 80s or 90s under one documentation system, and then you returned and, you know, their documentation system maybe only made sense to those who were using it, and it's hard to translate. And you don't want to throw away that data because, like you said, the archaeological record is a finite resource. How would you recommend going about that? Maybe how did you approach that at Safi, which has also had a long, gosh, back to Bliss?
Yes. So I do want to note, I did only focus on the 14 seasons at Area E, but even in that period, I noticed that different excavators had different shorthand. There was a lot of time spent pulling out my hair, trying to translate it. What did they mean here? Is this the same shorthand here as it is here? What are they saying? But in the end, I think the biggest resource for me in that process was talking to other people that had excavated with those people. And you're talking about documentation systems. Oof. When they switch, it's a whole change in mindset. So the way I did it at Safi was I approached it in chunks, because the documentation systems changed as well between 2011 and 2012 and 2015 and 2016, 2014, 2015. So if you approach it in chunks, if you take what you have and put it in, then sometimes what I realized anyway was that some of the other material that's not making sense kind of falls into place once you can visually see it and once you kind of sort out what you know for sure. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the daunting process, but taking it in chunks and talking to those individuals and sometimes they didn't even write something down. They'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that day when we found that, and it was and you're like, why didn't you write it down?
As a side note, I wish I had that memory when I was in the field. Oh, I remember that day we pulled out this, this, and this. Can't even remember what we did before breakfast. Anyway.
Exactly. I can't. Exactly, which is why it's important to document.
Yes.
We did have a few questions roll in. First from Keith. Once you have finished, how will all these digital data be preserved in the long run? And he mentioned again, preserved as in, made accessible in the long run.
Yeah. So once this is finished, once the PhD is written, all of that is done. So these are going to be saved in accessible open source file formats for GIS, because that's the program that I'm using. So I'm going to save them in open source file formats, and as long as the site director and the area directors agree, which I'm pretty sure they do, because they want everyone to have it, they'll be available on the wonderful World Wide Web to look at, manipulate. And I noticed one further down that it kind of pulls into it. So it's not just the digitization of the information that I'm outlining, but we are looking at doing 3D modeling because we do have LiDAR scans as well. So we're looking at integrating all of this in the next few years to, so we're looking at integrating all of this to create kind of the dream would be like a walkthrough of what an early Bronze Age house would look like and how it would be set up. But
that would be really cool, especially in the Zoom age when we're doing this a lot of this over online. It's really important to have that kind of digital data, and especially for access. And thinking about, who's going to excavate Safi in 50 years from now.
Yep.
Make sure they don't have to deal with the same problems that we're currently dealing with.
Exactly.
So Mark also asked, do you intend to incorporate information from the site from the 1920s or 1950s or any other time frame, or are you just interested in the very recent past?
So with the period that I'm analyzing, the small Israel Antiquities Authority salvage excavations didn't reach the early Bronze Age levels. So for my current research, I'm not integrating the salvage excavations in there. And Bliss and McAllister's data really focused on the late Bronze and Iron Ages. And it was not in the same area of the tell that I am focusing on. So as of right now, for the PhD, I'm not integrating any of that. It would be really great to, but it's not an immediate goal, I should say.
A postdoc goal. A 20-year career goal.
Yes, a 20-year career goal. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, we have a couple more questions from Mark again. What do you do when you find very obvious errors in the original records? Ooh, I also wonder that.
So since we have so many different ways of documentation at Safi, we have daily basket lists, we have locus lists, and where everything's documented a couple times. Sometimes it's really easy to see obvious errors, and I make a note of it in the database that it has been corrected to the most common. So say they transcribe a basket note, the last two numbers in a basket number. Instead of 32, it's 23. I look at the date, I look at the basket list, I try and figure it out, and then I make a note in the database as to which way I corrected it, so that it's documented that there have been changes, but in that way I can also later link specialist databases, because they go off of the data on the tags, and it helps with that as well.
Excellent. One of my COVID activities, summer activities, was going through and figuring out faunal data that was mislabeled, and ended up just looking at the bone and trying to decipher handwriting of, is this a 4, is this a 9, and then cross-checking those lists. So it's very important.
Yes, and tedious.
Tedious. My eyes almost fell out of my head. Mark asked, do you differentiate the records by the names of the person who created the original document based on different handwriting, or some other means that only you can see based on looking at huge amounts of data?
Okay, so this is kind of twofold. The maps are always drawn by a square supervisor or supervisor of multiple squares. So that is documented on the hand-drawn maps. And then the basket lists are always done by the registrar for the area. So those are all documented elsewhere. I do make a note of which map I'm pulling the data off of in the database, because sometimes there are multiple maps that were done in a day. But usually I start an entire section with, it's this year, which means that we know the registrar. It's this square, which means that we know the square supervisor. And then if I have to pull in stuff from field journals, that's where I'll make a more obvious documentation of whose it was. Does that make sense?
I think so. Well, we'll see if he throws in another question. So Keith, I could think this is a follow-up from his question on how you plan on making this data public. You personally putting the data on the web deals with today, but will you be archiving it in an institution that is capable of and responsible for keeping it readable, available 10 or 20 or 50 years from now, like ADS or TDAR?
So that is the goal, although I hate to put it this way, but it's a little above my pay grade. As a PhD researcher, it's really up to my advisor, who's one of the area supervisors, and the site director. But we have been talking about who to possibly archive it with. And that's what I meant with putting it on the web, is the archival process. So of course, it'll be with the wonders and advancements of online journals today, we can also link websites and databases and such. But in the long run, that is the goal, is to archive it all online.
Excellent. And then another question, are there standards for creating 3D models, etc.? The Kelsey Museum did some excavations from the 1920s that they are trying to digitize record. It would be good if there was some similarities or at least learning from their experiences.
Okay. That's a difficult question in some ways because the standards for creating 3D models and such, the 3D modeling is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, if I'm honest. So I'm focusing on the GIS and the mapping, but there are some standardization processes, but there's a lot of this is the general idea of what you should be doing and then fit in with the data that you have, if that makes sense. Because especially with records from the 20s, from the 30s, even from the teens and before, you don't necessarily have as specific a data as you would want. So that sometimes constrains what you're able to do. So I'd love to answer more specifically if you have some specific examples, but yeah, on a general basis, it's kind of hard to address that.
It's also, I guess that maybe not so much a follow-up question, but as a comment. So at HESI, we had Petrie and Bliss excavate, and we have all their data, but there's a difference in, quite obviously in technology, what was happening. So them drawing a square on, at a 10 hectare site, and you're like, oh, and how do we correlate that data and, go back in and thinking about re-excavating it, even that misalignment of how things were recorded and with the technology that was reported then can be difficult. Oh, we had another one who's in from John Farmer. Low priority question from a non-academic with educational archaeological interest. There's no low priority questions. My limited knowledge of the potential loss of digital data when Earth sustains profound electromagnetic bursts as a result of extreme solar flares, such as those that allow to the year dating of the Viking sites in Newfoundland, are archaeologists keeping non-magnetic backup copies of the updated digitized data? So I think keeping hard copies on top of the digital data.
As of right now, I'm not. I have backups of backups of backups, but nothing that might be considered a hard copy. Hopefully, one day it'll be feasible to keep more of a hard copy, but yeah.
Hopefully the internet doesn't crash and the world does not burn.
Yeah, or your computer crash the day that has your most recent version the day before you're supposed to give a presentation at an academic conference.
Yeah. The joys of the digital age.
Yes, that is something that I wanted to mention, is that while all of this digitization is great, also just creating hard copies of the hard copies is important. Especially, Kara, you're talking about Bliss and Petrie, and like Bliss and McAllister's excavations in 1898, 99, published in 1902. They're all so fragile right now that even scanning in and printing them, as well as having a backup digital copy, is important, especially if you're going to be working with them more frequently, because they're so friable, so easily. Yeah. Yep.
Absolutely. And there's so much that we've already lost. And if we're doing such destructive excavations, we want to make sure we keep, as much data as possible.
Yep.
Kate Moore, you breezed by monotony. Were the costs of doing this work worth it in some other ways? What did you learn about the site? How could you have trained other people to help you?
Okay, so to address the last part of that question first, could I have trained other people to help me? Yes. As monotonous as the work was, I did have a couple undergraduates helping me my first year. And they quickly went, is there something more fun that we can do? And as volunteers, since I wasn't, because at my university, that's the way it was working, we didn't, as volunteers, I went, let's find something more fun for you guys to do. Let's have you guys work with materials. Or so eventually I bit the bullet and sat down, and I'm sure my neighbors hated me because I blared music and I would work for 10 or 12 hours just digitizing. And something that was really interesting to me that I learned about the site though was just, you can see it at the site, you can sometimes see it in pictures, but as you're inputting data, you start to realize, like, yeah, area E is on a slope, but how much of a slope? Oh, you mean that the house that's a meter or half a meter above the one across the alleyway, they're from the exact same phase? Those types of things. And it really, yes, it was monotonous. Yes, it was mind-numbing at points, but it really helped kind of solidify my understanding of the site or of the area as a whole. So
it's a great learning project. Like you
it
can't get to know your site any better than working through all that data.
You can't.
So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it was monotonous. It was mind-numbing. It was the bad example of the map that I showed was the nicest bad example I could find. I.e., I did have some squares that someone had taken their, you know how it is working with pencil and paper, and you always work with pencil because goodness gracious, if you mark something down in pen that was marked down incorrectly, and then it's hand smudged or partially erased and never rewritten, and yeah. So
I can, only imagine.
Yes, but to answer the first part of Kate's question, yes, the costs were worth it in the end. I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and now I can actually start playing with the data. I can start doing some analysis rather than just input. So yeah.
And totally understandable when, we're always trying to get undergrads involved and get them, excited on this journey in archaeology. And so many of them were like, oh, we want to work with the pottery or the bones. And they're like, how about we digitize data? And, can
yeah. And they go, but it's computer work. Can't you just do it?
So yeah, it's great to know that it was worth it in the end, and now that you can play with it. And maybe those students who started out in that project be like, well, look at this end product that we have now. It's really cool.
One thing that I've noticed with the students that switch to work with the materials is now they're coming back and going, well, can you show me where this came from? I'm like, yep. And that's really where it gets interesting. Yeah. Like you have the special finds, you have the amulets, you have the figurines that already had points on the maps. But now they go and they find, say, a full bone, they find like bone ornamentations, or they find other sorts of things, and they go, well, can you show me where this might have come from? Yeah, I can show you the general area where that came from, or the centroid of that basket. So it is more worth it once everything's in. It just, like I said, it was a long road getting there.
Yeah, but worth it seeing the big picture.
Yes, definitely.
Mark asked, would it be worthwhile for you to do another site, or was it worth it only for you to get your PhD?
That's a very loaded question. Now that I have a better idea of what I'm doing, because one thing I didn't mention is that coming into this project, I had no GIS background. I had no spatial analysis background. I had worked on sites. I had done hand-drawn maps. I had done a lot of that aspect, but actually putting it into the computer, all of that, I was a materials person before I started with the spatial analysis. So I would say, yes, I think it would be worthwhile to do another site, but I think it would be a lot easier to do that because I have an idea of how to start, and I have tricks now, and I have you have ways of working and getting the work done quicker because you've done one set already. Yeah, it's like playing a level in a video game. you've played that level already, so it takes you half the time. Sorry to.
That's a good analogy. I like that. I like that a lot. Well, if no more questions roll in, I see we're almost at time. Give it just another hot second. But thank you so much, Sarah. That was really informative, and I think something so important for all of us grad students to be thinking about while we're working with our data, working with sites that may have been excavated previous, and how to, start thinking about where our documentation is going to be going into the future. Well, deep in my heart, I hope you've had a solution that helps. Good work.
Thank you, Kate.
And I guess we'll end on this final question of: are you a better archaeologist because of what you did?
I feel like yes, in a lot of ways, because even now, when I'm after my first year putting data in, I would be at a site, I'd be working, and I'd go, well, I don't need to write that down. Yes, I do. Yes, I need to write that down. I need to document it right now, because otherwise I'm going to forget it. Or no, I'm not going to use shorthand. I'm going to write out the word that I'm talking about. So in that sense, I think that's one application that's not the data driven that has really helped me, if that makes sense. That's one thing that's really come out of this whole thing, is like reinforcing that just what needs to be done in the field and why. And it's given me examples of when I am working with students in the field. They go, but why do I have to do that? I said, because look at this right here. This is why.
It all comes full circle.
It does. It does.
Awesome. Right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. This was great. Thank you, everybody, for attending. The recording will be up shortly on our YouTube channel. And stay tuned for next week's Brown Bag Lecture, same time, same place. But thank you again so much, Sarah. It was great to see you and to hear about your research.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks. You too. Everyone have a great day.